Why people lose the will to live. Viktor Frankl's search for meaning. There is a moment that does not arrive with drama. No explosion, no collapse, no single tragic event. It arrives quietly. A moment when a person wakes up and realizes that nothing inside them is pulling them forward anymore. They still breathe, they still function, they still move through the world. But the inner tension that once made life feel necessary is gone. This is not the same as sadness. It is not always depression, and it is not weakness. Viktor Frankl observed this state in its most extreme form inside Nazi concentration camps. He watched men who survived hunger, cold, and brutality, only to suddenly give up. Not because their bodies failed, but because something inside them collapsed first. Frankl noticed a disturbing pattern. When a person lost a reason to live, the body soon followed. People often assume that survival is driven primarily by instinct, that the will to live is automatic, but Frankl's experience revealed something deeply unsettling and profoundly important. The will to live is not automatic. It is conditional. It depends on meaning. Frankl saw prisoners who were physically weaker outlive those who were stronger. He saw men endure unbearable suffering not because they were optimistic, but because they felt their life was still asking something of them. A task, a responsibility, a meaning not yet fulfilled. And when that sense disappeared, even hope was not enough. This insight directly challenges the modern belief that happiness is the primary fuel of life. Frankl argued the opposite. Happiness is not the cause of meaning. It is the byproduct of it. When meaning vanishes, happiness cannot sustain a person for long. Today, people lose the will to live without facing camps or barbed wire. The modern world offers comfort, convenience, and stimulation. Yet the same inner collapse appears everywhere. People say, "I don't know why I'm tired. I have everything, but I feel empty. I wake up and feel nothing pulling me forward." From Frankl's perspective, this is not a psychological malfunction. It is an existential signal. Meaning does not disappear because life becomes painful. Meaning disappears when pain becomes pointless. Frankl never claimed that suffering itself ennobles a person. He was very clear. Unnecessary suffering degrades, but unavoidable suffering, when faced with meaning, transforms the human being. The question then is not, how do I avoid pain? Or how do I feel better? The real question is far more unsettling. What is life demanding from me now? When a person can no longer answer that question, life begins to feel negotiable, optional, replaceable. And that is the moment when the will to live starts to erode, not dramatically, but silently. Frankl believed that the deepest human motivation is not pleasure, power, or survival. It is the search for meaning. When that search collapses, something essential fractures inside the human psyche. This is where most people misunderstand despair. Despair is not the presence of suffering. It is the absence of meaning within suffering. And until that distinction is understood, no amount of comfort, distraction, or positive thinking will restore the will to live. Frankl's answer does not begin with motivation. It begins with responsibility. And that changes everything. The rise of the existential vacuum. Viktor Frankl described a condition that he believed would become one of the greatest psychological challenges of the modern age. He called it the existential vacuum. It is not despair in the dramatic sense. It is not acute suffering. It is a quiet, persistent emptiness, a sense that life lacks direction, urgency, and inner necessity. Frankl noticed that when traditional sources of meaning weaken, people do not become free. They become disoriented. For most of human history, meaning was largely inherited. Religion, culture, family roles, and survival itself provided a framework that answered the question of why one should live. Modern society dismantled much of that framework. Freedom increased, choice expanded, comfort grew. But meaning was not automatically replaced. The result is a paradox Frankl warned about. When people are no longer told what they must do, they often do not know what they ought to do. This vacuum does not always feel painful at first. It often feels like boredom, restlessness, a vague dissatisfaction that cannot be traced to any specific problem. People fill it with stimulation, work, entertainment, consumption, achievement, pleasure, noise. But stimulation is not meaning, and when stimulation fades, the emptiness returns, often stronger than before. Frankl observed that the existential vacuum expresses itself in three main ways: depression, aggression, and addiction. Not because people are broken, but because the human psyche cannot tolerate prolonged meaninglessness. When meaning disappears, the mind searches for substitutes. Power becomes a substitute. Pleasure becomes a substitute. Control becomes a substitute. Yet none of them answer the deeper question of why one exists. This is why people can be successful, admired, and financially secure, and still feel internally hollow. External achievement does not automatically generate inner significance. Frankl emphasized that meaning cannot be invented arbitrarily. It is not a story we tell ourselves to feel better. Meaning emerges from engagement with life's demands, not from introspection alone. Modern psychology often asks, "What do you want from life?" Frankl reversed the question, "What does life want from you?" When a person stops experiencing life as something that expects a response, responsibility dissolves. Without responsibility, the will weakens. And without will, even minor difficulties feel unbearable. The existential vacuum is dangerous precisely because it is subtle. People do not collapse, they drift. They remain functional but disconnected, alive but not inwardly engaged. Frankl warned that when this state becomes chronic, people begin to experience life as meaningless in itself. Not temporarily confusing, but fundamentally empty. At that point, the will to live does not vanish in a dramatic crisis. It erodes through indifference, and indifference is more corrosive than suffering. Suffering still confronts a person with a question. Indifference convinces them there is no question worth answering. This is why Frankl considered the loss of meaning more dangerous than pain. Pain can be endured, meaninglessness cannot. The modern world does not suffer from a lack of answers. It suffers from a lack of meaningful questions. Until a person reconnects with a sense of responsibility toward life, toward something or someone beyond themselves, the existential vacuum remains. And as long as it remains, the will to live stands on fragile ground. Frankl's answer does not lie in returning to old belief systems blindly, nor in rejecting freedom. It lies in learning how to respond to life again, consciously, personally, and responsibly. That response is the foundation of meaning, and without it, the vacuum continues to grow. Meaning is discovered, not invented. One of Viktor Frankl's most misunderstood ideas is the nature of meaning itself. Many assume that meaning is something we create, a personal narrative we construct to cope with life. Frankl strongly disagreed. Meaning, in his view, is not invented. It is discovered. This distinction is crucial. If meaning were merely a subjective creation, it would collapse the moment suffering becomes intense. A story we tell ourselves can be rewritten or abandoned when life becomes too painful. But something that is discovered carries weight. It confronts us. It demands a response. Frankl argued that life is constantly asking questions of us, and meaning emerges from how we answer them, not from how we feel about them. This is why he rejected the idea that meaning depends on happiness, success, or favorable conditions. If meaning required comfort, then suffering would automatically destroy it. Yet Frankl observed the opposite. People often discover their deepest meaning precisely when comfort disappears. Meaning is not found by looking inward endlessly. Excessive self-focus, Frankl warned, intensifies emptiness rather than resolves it. The more a person obsesses over their own fulfillment, the more elusive fulfillment becomes. Instead, meaning arises from self-transcendence, the movement beyond oneself towards something or someone that calls for commitment. Frankl identified three primary avenues through which meaning is discovered. The first is through creative work or contribution, what we give to the world. This does not refer only to careers or grand achievements. It includes any act in which a person brings something into existence or improves what already exists. Purpose is not measured by scale, but by sincerity of engagement. The second avenue is through love, what we receive from the world. To truly see another person, to recognize their uniqueness, and to commit to their existence is itself a source of meaning. Frankl believed love reveals meaning not by possession, but by responsibility. When someone matters to us, life matters. The third avenue is the most difficult and the most misunderstood. Meaning is discovered through suffering, but only when suffering is unavoidable. Frankl was precise here. He did not glorify pain. He did not claim that suffering is good. He insisted that suffering has meaning only when it cannot be removed, and when a person chooses their attitude toward it. This choice is not about optimism. It is about dignity. Even when everything is taken away, Frankl argued, one freedom remains: the freedom to choose one's stance toward fate. In that stance, meaning can still be found. This is why Frankl believed despair occurs not when suffering exists, but when suffering is experienced as meaningless. When pain has no context, no direction, no why, it crushes the human spirit. But when suffering becomes a task, something that demands courage, patience, or fidelity, it transforms from a threat into a responsibility. This perspective radically alters the question of the will to live. The will does not survive because life is pleasant. It survives because life still expects something from the person living it. Meaning, then, is not abstract. It is concrete, situational, and personal. What gives meaning to one life at one moment may not apply to another, or even to the same person at a different time. Life never stops questioning us. The tragedy begins when we stop listening. Frankl's answer to the loss of the will to live is not self-expression, nor self-fulfillment, nor escape from suffering. It is the rediscovery of responsibility. The realization that one's life is still being asked something, here and now. And as long as that question exists, the will to live can be restored. When suffering becomes the last human freedom, Viktor Frankl reached his most radical conclusion in the darkest place imaginable. Not in a university, not in theory, but in conditions where freedom, identity, and dignity were systematically stripped away. In the concentration camps, prisoners lost everything that normally defines a human life: their homes, their professions, their families, their future plans. Even their names were replaced by numbers. What remained was bare existence. And yet Frankl observed something that contradicted every deterministic theory of human behavior. Even there, especially there, people still differed profoundly in how they responded. Some became brutal, some became indifferent, and some, astonishingly, remained inwardly free. Frankl concluded that suffering does not automatically degrade a person. What degrades a person is the loss of inner freedom in the face of suffering. When suffering is unavoidable, the question shifts. It is no longer, how do I escape this, but who will I become through this? This is where Frankl located the last of the human freedoms, the freedom to choose one's attitude toward circumstances that cannot be changed. This freedom is often misunderstood. It is not denial. It is not passive acceptance, and it is certainly not positive thinking. It is a moral stance, an inner decision about how one will relate to fate. Frankl saw prisoners who comforted others while starving themselves, men who shared their last piece of bread, people who preserved humor, kindness, or quiet dignity in a system designed to erase those qualities. These acts did not change the external situation, but they changed the meaning of the situation. Suffering became a task. Frankl believed that when suffering becomes a task, it no longer destroys the will to live. It summons it. The person is no longer merely enduring pain. They are answering a call. This insight is deeply uncomfortable for the modern mind. We are conditioned to believe that meaning depends on control, that when control disappears, meaning disappears with it. Frankl argued the opposite. Control is not the foundation of meaning. Responsibility is. Even when control is lost, responsibility remains. Responsibility for one's inner posture, responsibility for one's response, responsibility for the example one sets, even if no one seems to be watching. This is why Frankl rejected the idea that humans are purely products of biology or environment. Those forces shape us, but they do not fully determine us. Between stimulus and response, there remains a space, and in that space lies choice. When people lose the will to live, it is often because they believe that space no longer exists, that everything meaningful has already been taken from them. Frankl's work insists otherwise. As long as a person can choose how they suffer, suffering has not stripped life of meaning. This does not romanticize pain. Frankl was clear: unnecessary suffering should be removed whenever possible. Medicine, therapy, and social support matter. But when suffering cannot be eliminated, it must be transformed, or it will destroy the person enduring it. Transformation does not make suffering pleasant. It makes it bearable. And more than that, it makes it significant. The will to live does not require comfort. It requires a reason to endure discomfort. Frankl's answer is unsettling because it places responsibility back into the hands of the individual, even in circumstances that feel utterly unfair. Yet it is precisely this responsibility that restores dignity. When life hurts, meaning does not disappear. It changes its form. And when a person understands that, the will to live is no longer dependent on circumstances, but anchored in something deeper. Why modern life breaks the will quietly. The collapse of the will to live in the modern world rarely looks dramatic. It does not arrive through starvation, imprisonment, or physical terror. It arrives through comfort without meaning. Viktor Frankl warned that a life organized entirely around convenience, pleasure, and efficiency risks something far more dangerous than suffering: inner emptiness. Modern individuals are rarely asked to endure. They are asked to choose. And when choice is no longer guided by meaning, it becomes paralyzing rather than liberating. Frankl observed that when external constraints disappear, internal guidance must take their place. If it does not, people drift. They consume. They distract themselves. They remain busy while feeling internally disengaged. This is why the loss of the will to live today often appears as chronic exhaustion, emotional numbness, or a persistent sense that life lacks urgency. People are not overwhelmed by pain. They are underwhelmed by significance. Without a compelling why, even minor frustrations feel intolerable. When life does not demand something meaningful from a person, the psyche begins to interpret existence itself as unnecessary. Frankl described this as a form of existential frustration, not frustration caused by obstacles, but by the absence of meaningful tension. Human beings, he argued, do not need equilibrium. They need tension, a healthy pull between who they are and what they are called to become. When this tension disappears, vitality declines. Modern culture often treats tension as something to eliminate. Stress is seen as pathological. Discomfort is framed as a sign that something is wrong. But Frankl believed the opposite. The absence of tension is far more damaging. A life without demands does not free the human spirit. It weakens it. This explains why people with comfortable lives can feel internally bankrupt. When nothing is at stake, existence begins to feel optional. Frankl saw this clearly in patients who complained not of suffering, but of meaninglessness. They were not asking for happiness. They were asking for direction. Modern solutions often miss the mark. They focus on symptom management rather than existential orientation. Medication, entertainment, and productivity systems may reduce discomfort, but they do not answer the question of why one should get up in the morning. Frankl's approach was different. He did not ask people what they wanted from life. He asked them what life was asking from them, now, in their concrete situation. Meaning does not emerge from abstract ideals. It emerges from commitment to something beyond the self. A task, a person, a responsibility that cannot simply be replaced. The modern world encourages endless substitution. If something becomes difficult, replace it. If it loses pleasure, abandon it. If it demands sacrifice, avoid it. But meaning does not survive substitution. It deepens through perseverance. This is why the will to live erodes quietly in modern life. People are not crushed by hardship. They are dissolved by irrelevance. When nothing seems necessary, life itself begins to feel unnecessary. Frankl's answer is not a rejection of modernity. It is a correction. Comfort is not the enemy. Emptiness is. Freedom is not the problem. The absence of responsibility is. A meaningful life is not one without suffering, but one with something worth suffering for. Until modern individuals rediscover that axis of responsibility, the will to live remains fragile. Not because life is too hard, but because it feels too shallow. How the will to live is restored. Viktor Frankl never believed that the will to live could be restored through persuasion, motivation, or reassurance. Encouragement alone does not rebuild meaning. Advice alone does not awaken responsibility. The will to live returns when a person reconnects with something that expects them. Frankl's therapeutic approach, known as logotherapy, was grounded in this principle. Rather than asking patients to analyze their past endlessly, he redirected their attention outward, toward unfinished tasks, unfulfilled responsibilities, and relationships that still depended on them. This shift is subtle but decisive. When a person is focused exclusively on their own suffering, despair intensifies. The self becomes the center of all experience, and pain fills the entire field of awareness. Frankl observed that meaning begins to reappear only when attention moves beyond the self, not toward distraction, but toward obligation. Obligation, in Frankl's sense, is not imposed from the outside. It is discovered. It emerges from recognizing that life has not finished asking its questions. A child who still needs guidance, a work that remains incomplete, a truth that has not yet been spoken, a suffering that can still be borne with dignity. Frankl often asked patients to imagine themselves in the future, looking back on the present moment. From that imagined vantage point, the meaning of present suffering often became clearer. Pain was no longer meaningless. It became part of a story that still required completion. This temporal shift restores the will to live because it reintroduces continuity. Life is no longer a closed system of present discomfort. It becomes a process moving toward something that still matters. Frankl also emphasized that meaning cannot be forced. It cannot be commanded or manufactured, but it can be invited by changing one's stance toward life. This is why he warned against making happiness a goal. Happiness pursued directly evaporates. Happiness follows when a person is absorbed in something meaningful beyond themselves. The same applies to the will to live. It does not return when someone demands it return. It returns when life becomes necessary again. Frankl believed that even small responsibilities can anchor a person against despair. Meaning does not require heroic missions. It requires sincerity and commitment. A person who knows why they must endure today can endure almost anyhow. Restoration, then, is not about eliminating pain. It is about recontextualizing it. Pain that is integrated into meaning no longer erodes the will. It strengthens it. Frankl's work offers a sober reassurance. Even when everything feels empty, the emptiness itself is a signal. It indicates not the absence of meaning, but the absence of connection to it. Life has not stopped asking. The person has stopped listening. When listening resumes, when responsibility is rediscovered, the will to live begins to reawaken, often quietly, often gradually, but decisively. Meaning does not shout. It calls. And those who respond find that the will to live was never destroyed, only suspended. Those who find a why can bear almost any how. Viktor Frankl's most quoted sentence is also his final answer to the question of why people lose and regain the will to live. Those who have a why to live can bear almost any how. This statement is often misunderstood as motivational optimism. It is not. It is a psychological and existential observation grounded in suffering, not comfort. Frankl did not mean that meaning removes pain. He meant that meaning reorders pain. When a person possesses a why, suffering no longer defines the entire experience of life. Pain becomes contextual. It occupies a place, but not the whole. Without a why, even small difficulties expand until they consume everything. This is why two people can face similar circumstances and respond in radically different ways. One collapses, the other endures. The difference is not strength, intelligence, or temperament. It is orientation. A why is not a vague hope. It is a concrete responsibility. Frankl insisted that meaning is always specific, not general, not universal, always tied to a particular moment and a particular person. What gives meaning to one life cannot simply be transferred to another. Life asks different questions of different people, and it asks them at different times. The tragedy of losing the will to live is not that life has no meaning. It is that the person believes the question has already been answered, or worse, that no question exists anymore. Frankl's work restores a crucial insight. Meaning is not behind us, and it is not guaranteed by the future. It exists in the present, waiting to be answered through action, commitment, and attitude. Even now, even here, even in circumstances that feel empty or unfair. The will to live does not require certainty. It requires direction. It requires the sense that one's existence still matters, not abstractly, but concretely. Frankl never promised fulfillment. He promised responsibility. And paradoxically, responsibility is what rescues people from despair. When a person realizes that life still expects something from them, not tomorrow, not someday, but now, the question of whether life is worth living changes entirely. Life is no longer evaluated. Life is responded to. This shift is subtle, but decisive. The will to live does not return as excitement. It returns as resolve, a quiet commitment to remain, to endure, to answer. Frankl's answer to the loss of the will to live is not comfort, distraction, or escape. It is meaning grounded in responsibility, meaning that survives suffering rather than fleeing from it. And as long as life continues to ask its questions, the will to live can always be restored, not because life is easy, but because it is still asking something of you. Life is still questioning you. Viktor Frankl ended his work with a quiet but demanding conclusion. The ultimate question is never whether life is worth living. The real question is whether we are willing to answer life. When people lose the will to live, they often believe that life has failed them, that it has withheld meaning, fairness, or purpose. Frankl reversed this logic completely. Life does not owe us meaning. Meaning arises when we respond to what life asks of us. This perspective removes both entitlement and despair. It removes entitlement because meaning is not something to be received passively. It removes despair because meaning is never exhausted as long as life continues. As long as you are alive, a question still exists. Frankl emphasized that this question is never abstract. It does not ask for philosophical perfection or heroic achievement. It asks for fidelity to the present moment, for a response that only you can give, in the situation you are in now. Meaning does not wait for ideal conditions. It appears precisely within limitation. This is why the will to live cannot be permanently destroyed by circumstances alone. It is destroyed only when a person concludes that no response is required anymore, that their presence makes no difference. Frankl's work stands as a refusal of that conclusion. Even suffering, even failure, even loss do not erase the possibility of meaning. They change the form it takes. What once demanded creation may now demand endurance. What once demanded action may now demand patience. What once demanded achievement may now demand dignity. Life shifts its questions, but it never stops asking. The danger of the modern age is not that life becomes unbearable. It is that it becomes optional, that people begin to believe their existence carries no obligation beyond comfort and survival. Frankl's answer restores gravity to existence. You are here because something is still unfinished. Something still depends on your response. Something would be lost if you disappeared. This is not a romantic idea, it is a responsibility. The will to live does not require certainty about the future. It requires loyalty to the present demand, to what must be carried, completed, protected, or endured now. Frankl believed that when a person fully grasps this, the question of suicide, despair, or withdrawal loses its authority. Life is no longer something to be judged. It becomes something to be answered. And answers are given through action, love, and attitude, not through explanations. The final tragedy, Frankl warned, is not suffering. It is the refusal to respond to life when suffering arrives. As long as you can still choose how to respond, your life retains meaning. And as long as meaning exists, the will to live can return, not loudly, not dramatically, but firmly. Life is still speaking. The only remaining question is whether you are willing to answer. The question that continues. Viktor Frankl never intended his work to provide comfort. He intended it to provide orientation. If this reflection has unsettled you, that is not a flaw. It is a signal. Meaning does not soothe first. It confronts. It interrupts the automatic way we move through life and forces a deeper awareness. My existence is not neutral. Frankl believed that the most dangerous illusion is the belief that life has already said everything it has to say to us. In reality, life keeps asking, quietly, persistently, through circumstances we did not choose. The loss of the will to live does not mean that the question has ended. It means the question has gone unanswered for too long. This channel exists for those moments, not to give ready-made answers, but to help you recognize the questions that still matter, the ones hidden beneath exhaustion, emptiness, or quiet despair. The kind of questions that, once seen clearly, begin to restore direction. Frankl warned that meaning cannot be handed down. It must be discovered personally. But discovery does not happen in isolation. It happens through reflection, confrontation, and sustained inquiry. That is what this space is for. If life is still questioning you, and it is, then this conversation is not finished. In the next exploration, we will go deeper into a tension Frankl considered unavoidable, the conflict between freedom and responsibility, and why absolute freedom without meaning often leads not to fulfillment, but to collapse. Stay with the question. Because as long as you are still being questioned, your life has not lost its meaning, and those who continue to search do not lose the will to live, they refine it.